I'm back. So this week I had planned to go over causation. I thought that the Searle lecture last week would be sufficient for preparing you for your paper, since it is on the Chinese room. But in grading your last few reading responses, I became concerned that a number of you do not understand the relevant concept. And while a number of you did show that you understood what's going on with the Chinese room, there was something of a frame problem in that you failed to recognize what's important for us. So I want to go back and talk about Searle, talk about the Chinese room a little bit, and then finish up talking about mental content. Go on to causation next week. This is going to put us a little bit behind, so we've used up the 1 week of wiggle room that we have at the end of the semester. This works fine for now, but then the turnaround for the third paper is going to be even tighter than it was before. Now, the Chinese room, as Searle presents it, is concerned primarily with strong artificial intelligence. Whether you could ever get a computer, and we'll have to say what that means, to have a mind. Whether you could get truly intelligent computers, various ways of cashing out what strong AI is, but something like a computer that has a mind. While that's the context in which the argument is presented, that's not our concern. And Searle does present the Chinese room at times in response to people who make the claim that you could have strong AI, you could have a computer that thinks, but that's not the right contrast class for our concerns. Rather, what he's doing is responding to anyone who might claim that we could get mind from syntax alone, say the way Fodor claimed. And he's responding to any sort of internalist. Well, possibly. It concerns internalism. Depending on exactly what we understand Searle to be doing, maybe he's against internalism, maybe he's for internalism. It depends. But roughly, the concern is that, well, look, if we have a system that only is capable of syntax, then we can't get semantics. If we can't get semantics, we can't have intentionality. If we can't have intentionality, we can't have mental content, or rather we can't have the full range of mental content that we have. If we can't have that full range of mental content that we have, then there is no mind. Mind turns on mental content that is intentional. If we can't get semantics from syntax, then it all falls down. We can't get mind from syntax alone. I said their full range of mental content because it seems that there is mental content that is not intentional, not about anything. But it seems that if you were to have a system that had mental content that was only non-intentional, then you have something that's clearly different than the human mind. And the question of strong AI is whether you could get from a computer something that has a mind like a human. So I'm not going to go over the Chinese room example, but you should go through that as he goes through it. You should explain it the way he explains it. The parts of the example are important. Don't in your paper present the Chinese room example while at the same time making a parallel to other things. Present the example, then go on to talk about the example. It's important that you do it that way, otherwise you're going to fall into confusion. But after the Chinese room experiment, he gives this argument. And I want to run through this argument for a number of reasons. One is so that we can look at each of his premises but also so I can make clear what the premises are, because a number of you talked in your responses as if his premises were conclusions. And it's important you understand the difference in premises and conclusions. I don't have time to run through deductive logic. If you're confused about that, look it up. Look about the relationship between premises and conclusions. So his argument first, he says brains cause minds. Well, right after he says that, he says that this is a bit crude, and then he goes on to say, what I really mean is that mental content's entirely caused by brains. I think that this first premise, even as he makes it less crude, is way too crude. I mean, this first premise is a complete and absolute mess. It's certainly not the case that brains cause minds. If I pull your brain out of your head, throw it on the table, there's not a mind being produced by that brain. So it seems that this first premise, depending on how we understand it, I mean, another thing is that oftentimes, very loosely, we talk about brains causing minds. Even I've done this, I've talked about, well, look, whatever the mind is, it corresponds to something that occurs in the brain, but really, of course, this is false. It doesn't correspond to something in the brain, it corresponds to something in the body, including the nervous system, not just the brain, the spinal cord, the various nerves, optic nerves, input systems, eyes, ears, all of that. The mind corresponds to something, some proper part of all of that system. So this first one either is just false. It is way too crude. Brains don't cause minds. Or we could be very charitable here, allow some cashing out on our part of what he's saying and say, okay, you're saying that the human system, biological system with brains, nervous system, input systems, and so forth, do cause minds. That is, humans have minds, and the reason they have minds is based on their brain and other biological parts. So we'll go ahead and say, okay, we won't say false, we'll be charitable there. But then he says, well, how else do we interpret this? How would we interpret this? Well, why would he say such a thing, this first premise? Well, this first premise, if we don't take it to be completely false, then the oomph of it, the point of it is that brains are somehow special. Biology is somehow special. So lots of what I'm going to be doing today is sort of tearing into Searle. Searle presents his argument as if he's responding to something spooky. You know, he names these people, he says, look, there are these people who will say things, oh, they're so brave. I would never be so confident, so brave to say something like my thermostat has beliefs. That's spooky. But Searle seems not to understand that what he does is much spookier than that. Searle essentially is saying there's something magical going on. So I'll be tearing into Searle a little bit, but in doing that, I want to do it in a constructive sort of way so that you can see the different prongs of his argument, how it connects to internalism, externalism, how it connects to the syntax semantics issue. So first premise, brains cause minds. Second premise, and now this is important, this is a premise, this is not a conclusion. Syntax is not sufficient for semantics. That is, it is possible to have syntax without having semantics. Just because you have syntax does not mean you have semantics. Syntax alone does not produce semantics. It's important to recognize this is a premise. This is not a conclusion. This is not something that he takes to have shown. This is something he's assuming in his argument. And we could argue against this premise directly. We think maybe this is just an assumption. One possibility here, we have not ruled out up front that internalism could be true. Fodor takes this premise to be false. Fodor thinks you can get semantics from syntax. Maybe not having syntax is having semantics, but having syntax gives you the tools for building semantics at the very least. And so Fodor would say you can go from syntax to semantics. Now, possibly we think this premise to be supported in some way by his Chinese room example, but thought experiments, now for one thing, thought experiments are not experiments, they're not empirical. They're done by sitting down and thinking, right? They're analytic. So he wasn't actually locking people in rooms and feeding them Chinese symbols. Don't confuse a thought experiment for an empirical experiment, not that sort of experiment. Rather, it's supposed to do a number of things. It's supposed to expand on explained concepts. It's supposed to pump your intuitions to believe what he wants you to believe. It's not an experiment, and it's also not an argument. So we might think that he's given some support to this second premise through his Chinese room experiment, but he has not argued for this, at least not by way of the Chinese room experiment. He is assuming this. He's stating it is the case. Syntax is not sufficient for semantics. Other people like Fodor would say, hold on, that's just not true. And so while he says this and then he uses this in his argument, this still is up for debate, and we'll come back to this and show that it is actually debated. Third premise, computers have only syntax. Computers have only syntax. That is, only syntax means not semantics. So of course it's not true that they have only syntax. They have lots of things, including a power chord. That's not the issue. The issue is that they do not have semantics. We have to be careful here because this looks nice. It looks like this is a contentful sort of thing to say, hey look, computers only have syntax. But we have to put a big asterisk here on computer because he says, well, anything could be described as or as if it were a digital computer. Humans could be described in such a way that they're computers running programs. But humans have semantics. That is, they don't only have syntax. So it's just not true that computers have only syntax. Some computers, namely humans, have semantics. So I put an asterisk here. So what does he mean? Well, he means by computer something specific. He means a purely formal system. He's assuming, talking to the strong AI theorists, they're using desktops, laptops, these silicone-based things. Those things are called computers. Those things happen to be only formal systems. When he says computers have only syntax, he means those formal systems used by AI theorists. Not all computers, because humans are computers too, and they have semantics. Rather, only the silicone-based things, and those silicone-based things happen to be purely formal systems. But now, this premise 3 says that purely formal systems have only syntax. But it looked before like this was a big, useful, meaningful premise. Computers have only syntax. That's enlightening. That says something to us. But a purely formal system having only syntax, that's to restate the exact same thing. To say that it only has syntax is to say that it's purely formal. It is only in the form of the symbols. Rules of form of the symbols. To be purely formal is to not have meaning. To be only syntactic is to not have semantics. This is to say the exact same thing. So this is an analytic truth. It's true by the meaning of the terms, and therefore is not meaningful at all. It doesn't tell us anything. And then, finally, minds have semantics. Now, what do we mean here? Well, with minds, do we mean here that something analytic and vacuous like the third premise, that minds means something like a system that's not purely formal has semantics? Well, no, I don't think so. What he means here by mind is a system that has intentional content, propositional attitudes, qualia. There's something it's like to have a mind. We experience things with qualitative experiences. Anything that is capable of having qualitative experiences, of representing things qualitatively, has intentionality. If you have intentionality, you have semantics. So if you have a mind, mind means something that can experience and represent qualitatively, then you have semantics. First premise, as stated, looks false, but we're going to say, okay, we'll be charitable there and consider it not false. But then what he's saying is there's something special about brains and biological systems. That special thing allows the biological systems and the brains to have minds, qualitative experiences. Syntax is not sufficient for semantics. That's a unestablished, controversial premise. Computers have only syntax. Read as stated is false, even on his own admittance. Read in a way that it's true, it's vacuous, uninformative. Okay. Despite the issues with the premises, they could still be used in arguments. Conclusion 1, he says, no computer program by itself could yield mind. Why is this? Computer program, here he means a purely formal system. Purely formal system has only syntax, but syntax not sufficient for semantics. In order to have a mind, you have to have semantics. So a computer program by itself, you have to wonder what that means, could yield mind. Now, lots of this looks nice, and Searle talks very confidently, but we see in Bowden, we see in Dennett, lots of issues brought up with Searle. I mean, one, it seems nice to say no computer program by itself could yield mind. Sounds nice, sounds true, but as Dennett points out, well, of course, no computer program by itself could yield mind. What would that even mean? There's a computer program sitting on a shelf somewhere, not hooked up to a computer at all, and you're telling me that that couldn't produce mind, and this is supposed to be contentful philosophy? No, of course it couldn't. So the key here is to cash out what is meant by itself. Presumably, but to say no computer program by itself could yield mind is to say that a computer program with something else could yield mind. Otherwise, it's an uninteresting sentence. It's an uninteresting claim. But then what is the something else you have to add to a computer program to yield mind? Well, presumably something that allows you to have semantics. And Searle seems to think that only, or potentially only, biological systems could do that. So a computer program instantiated in a biological system could, not must, could yield mind. Okay. So various interpretations of this. One is that maybe he's just saying again that syntax can't produce semantics by itself. That's entirely uncontroversial. No one denies that. A few things, well, no, Fodor denies that, it seems. Possibly. At least Fodor denies that if our brains were installed with only syntax, we could get semantics. If we say only syntax by itself, that could not produce semantics. That's uncontroversial because you at least need, well, I mean, interaction of the syntactical system. You need interpretation of the syntax by something. You need functions, you need operations. So the claim that you can't get semantics from syntax, duh, no one denies that. The claim that you can't build semantics from a syntactical system is a system that can run operations and so on. At least Fodor denies that and thinks you can get semantics from a syntactical system, a purely syntactical system. But it seems that the bigger claim he's making here in this first conclusion is that, well, something is special about brains that allows them to run programs in a way that produces semantics and therefore can produce minds. And so the second conclusion, brains cause minds, but not only via a program, the biology matters. Now we start getting to this spookiness in Searle. It won't be terribly obvious right now, I don't think, in the Searle alone, but he keeps saying there's something special about the biology. Well, what is special about the biology? I don't know. I'm not sure that he knows, but it's the magic sort of thing that allows us to go from syntax to semantics. And now, issue here is that he's not really explaining much. He's explaining up to a point till we get to biology. He's saying, well, look, at these things can't produce semantics, they can't produce mind because they only have syntax. You have to have a different sort of thing to be able to produce mind in order to produce semantics. What kind of thing is that? Well, it's a biological thing. And now this looks a lot like Descartes. Well, how does a biological thing, what is it magical about biology that allows it to produce semantics, mind? I say magical there because he's not explaining anything. He's just saying you have a system, you have two systems that are exactly the same. That's what the Chinese room is supposed to show us. Two systems that are exactly the same. One of them has mind because it has biology. One of them does not have mind because it does not have biology. It's not biological. But what is it that's going on there? It seems magic. In thinking about the Chinese room experiment, the Chinese room itself, with the individual inside, we explain that experiment and then we make an analogy to other things. We can make an analogy to a computer and then he can use the experiment to argue against strong AI. We can make an analogy to the human and then we're concerned with other issues. So with strong AI, particularly we're concerned with the syntax semantic issue, possibly internalism also. When we make the analogy to the human, it seems maybe we're concerned more with internalism, externalism, but also with syntax semantics. And then third conclusion he has, I guess he has a fourth conclusion, but I'm not going to bother that one. Third conclusion, anything that produces a mind must have at least as much causal power as the human brain. I have no idea what the point of that argument is because he's already said that there's something special about biology. So he seems to want to deny, and in places has denied, that if you have a computer with as much causal power as the human brain, it still would not produce mind because it's not biological in nature. Now, we might want to question whether it's the actual biological constitution of the brain that gives it this ability to produce semantics, or if it's the biological history, the evolutionary history of the brain. He doesn't talk about any of this. There's a good reason he doesn't talk about any of this, because once he does, everything he does falls apart. But he wants to claim that, well, look, you could take this cyber brain. I'll come back to this. Maybe we'll talk about this a couple of times. But you have this. Imagine that you take your brain out, you replace it with a cybernetic system that has as much causal power as the human brain. And then the question there is, well, would you have a mind? He seems to want to say no, but he's somewhat non-committal at that point. But there's also, he considers the robot. So I'm going to come back to the cybernetic brain case. But there's also the robot case. He says, well, look, you could have a robot that goes through the world and acts just like I act, responds to inputs the same way I do, produces the same outputs, is as successful in life in general as I am. But this robot would fail to have a mind. That is, it would fail to have qualitative experiences, fail to have intentionality. It becomes so outlandish to say some of these things. If we think that the robot acts just like me but fails to have qualitative experiences, the full range of qualitative mental content I have, then this thing is a zombie, a philosophical zombie in the Chalmers sense. acts just like me but fails to have anything going on up top qualitatively. We might think that this is an argument against behaviorism, right? Because behaviorism says, well, we can study the mind through only inputs and outputs. But we have to be very careful here, because if we're concerned with radical behaviorism didn't claim there was a mind at all. They were limitativists about mind. So this is not any sort of counterexample or argument against behaviorism, because behaviorism said, well, all it is to have a mind is to have the right input-output relationships. There is nothing ontologically different about a mind from input-output relationships. So the zombie case, this Searle case in which you have a robot that acts just like me is a zombie, that's not a counterexample to behaviorism at all. It's not an argument against behaviorism at all. In a sense, Searle and the behaviorists would disagree, because the behaviorists would say that the zombie robot has as much of a mind as me because it has the same input-output relationship. Searle would say it does not have as much of a mind as me. But that's because Searle thinks there is something special about having a mind ontologically, and behaviorists don't. Neither one of them, they're not disagreeing on whether or not the zombie has mental experiences. They're disagreeing over whether I have mental experiences, but that disagreement was in place before anything Searle said. So Bowden comes in and points out a number of issues with Searle, and for one thing, she says, well, look, it seems that the person in the Chinese room, Searle wants to say that there's no intentionality there, but that's just false. I'm in the Chinese room, I see squiggles, and I think about these squiggles. I have thoughts about the squiggles, namely that this squiggle produces this squoggle. That's a thought about the squiggle. That's intentionality. Searle seems to miss this or run over this. Certainly, I don't have thoughts about what the squiggle represents. That is, I don't understand the squiggle as representing anything. It does represent something in the world. I don't have an intentional thought about the thing in the world because I don't understand Chinese, but I do have an intentional thought about the symbol itself. So Bowden points this out and says, well, look, Searle's just wrong that there's not intentionality in the case. There is intentionality in the case. But also there's a disanalogy here between the human. If we make the Chinese room an analogy to the human, we make it an analogy to the computer. Chinese room to the computer. The person in the Chinese room is something like the CPU running certain programs. Okay, that's the analogy. The whole room is a computer. The person in the room is a CPU running certain programs. The transformation of squiggle to squoggle, that is the program being run from an input to an output. The people putting in the squiggles and taking out the squoggles are the programmers and the users. Okay, that's the analogy if we make the analogy to the computer case. If we make the analogy to the human case, the person in the room is the mind, the room itself is the body, the squiggles input are sense input, the squoggles output are any sort of output, and then the people inputting squiggles and taking out squoggles, well, it's not entirely clear what they're supposed to be, and Searle doesn't want to make too much of that because he wants intentionality to come from some sort of magic biological phenomenon, not from someone inputting something to us. And I'll get to that in a second. But Bowden says, well, look, one, Searle's just wrong that there's no intentionality in that case. There is intentionality of the person in the room towards the squiggle. They have thoughts about the squiggle. But more so, even if Searle were to note this and say, well, there is that sort of, but this misses it, because intentionality is not a property of the brain. Intentionality is a property of people, right? And be careful in your wording to reading responses, because I've seen lots of things like, my brain told me. that doesn't really make any sense. My mind told me those things don't make sense. Brains don't tell us things. That's anthropomorphic. Your mind tells you something. What are you if you are not your mind? Okay? Difference in words here makes a big difference. It can go from saying something true to saying something false to saying something that doesn't make any sense at all. And intentionality is not a property of the brain, at least she's claiming, but a property of the entire system. Maybe. There's an issue there. It speaks to the analogy. Do we think intentionality is a property of the brain? Maybe if we think neuronal firing is symbols, and those symbols are somehow not only syntactical but semantical, and therefore those symbols are intentional, then that's what it would take for intentionality to be a property of the brain. Neuronal firing is a symbol, and we can get semantics from syntax, and therefore the neuronal firing means is about something in the world. She says, well, that's not usually the case. Rather, intentionality is a property of the mind. The mind is not cashed out by the brain only, but the brain plus other parts of the human body, plus maybe the external environment, so on. Intentionality is a product of that thing. And so intentionality is a property of the entire Chinese room, or the entire Chinese room plus the input-output individuals. But the person in the Chinese room, Bowden says, well, look, they understand something about the squiggles, that it leads to a certain squabble. They understand the rule book. There is some intentionality there. There's an intentionality to symbols. So my thought about the squiggle, I do have a thought about the squiggle. There's intentionality for the squiggle. The squiggle is a symbol that represents, that is, it is about, it has intentional representation of the world. Someone puts me in a squiggle that says tree, and I'm supposed to output a squiggle that says plant. The possibility. The squiggle that says tree is about trees. I have thoughts about the squiggle. The squiggle is about trees. There's intentionality from me to the symbol. There's intentionality from the symbol to the world. The only thing that's missing here is the connection. If I don't understand the symbol is intentionally about the world. If I did, then my intentional beliefs about the squiggle would carry on to be about the world. So I have intentionality about the symbols have intentionality about the world, but I'm failing to get my intentionality to the world. But then what's the difference between that and actual intentionality? We experience the world through mental representation. These mental representations are symbols. But when I think about the world, I can't think about the world except by way of my symbols. And so any thought I have about the world is really about the symbols, my representation of that world. The representation is about the world. My thoughts can only be about my representation. So I can only have intentionality towards the symbol. The symbol has some degree of accurate, inaccurate representation, intentionality about the world. It's not possible for me to have a thought about the world independent of symbolization. So any thoughts I have, any intentionality I have, is only about symbols. But it seems that that's what's going on in the Chinese room. I can't know that my representation of the world is accurate or not. The fact that I have a meaning associated with that is not tied to the fact that I can tell that my representation of the world corresponds to the world. Rather, it has to do with how well that representation fits with other representations I have. But it seems that the individual in the room knows all kinds of things about this squiggle leading to that squoggle, and sometimes this squiggle precedes this squiggle, and this squiggle looks a lot like this squiggle, and this squiggle makes me laugh, and this squiggle really pisses me off. That's a whole lot of thoughts connected together. Maybe they're fewer than we have, but then it's a matter of degrees. It's a quantitative difference between the Chinese room's intentionality and my intentionality, not a qualitative difference. Okay, so then let's move on to Dennett. And we have here a distinction, two distinctions actually, between original and derived intentionality, which is the one I'm going to talk most about, and as if real intentionality. The as if real intentionality, not quite as important. I'll mention it, but the real question here is about original versus derived intentionality. And when Searle says that there's something special about biological systems, something special about the brain that allows them to convert syntax to semantics, he's saying that brains have original intentionality. This is where Searle gets spooky. And I take it to be much less spooky to say that my thermostat has beliefs than it is to say that humans have original intentionality. Spooky in the sense that it's doing something that science cannot explain, cannot account for. That's our definition of spooky right now. So we had Searle, now we had Bowden. Let's imagine that Bowden comes in and says these things to Searle, and Searle says, okay, well maybe there is some intentionality had by the Chinese room. At times he seems to want to say this, though he's very arrogant in his responses, so he's not all that forward in the fact that he's willing to say this. But he says, okay, well I could admit some sort of intentionality for the Chinese room. And notice that the issue is not whether we could learn Chinese. That would be an additional issue. To say that we can't learn Chinese, the person in the room can't learn Chinese, that's an additional claim, which may or may not follow from the fact that the person does not know Chinese. It's not clear to me if every input, if you could have as an input every Chinese character and have as an output every Chinese character, you have a rule book that tells you every mapping relationship between every Chinese character to every other Chinese character, and you could run all of that, I really don't understand how that's any different than understanding Chinese. I can't possibly understand how that would be different. I can't understand what it would be like, what the mental life of the person in the box would be. But I don't know what additional beyond that it could be to understand Chinese. Whether we can learn Chinese is an additional issue. Really, the issue is not even whether we can understand Chinese, because Chinese is an analogy here. The issue is intentionality. That's it. And so the claim, Searle would not come in and say, okay, well, Bowden said something, and then I'll say, well, maybe the person in the box or the box itself does understand some Chinese. No, but he talks that way, but that's because that's an example of the issue of intentionality. So he comes in and he says, well, Bowden has said these things, and I might want to say, well, the box does have some sort of intentionality, but any intentionality had by the person in the box or the entire Chinese room system, that is derivative. It's derived from the programmers. If the programmers gave you a different rule book, then things would operate a different way. Any intentionality that is had by the Chinese room is derived from the programmers. And now we go back to the cyberbrain case. Oh, and so since it's derivative, and since humans have magic original intentionality, humans are vastly different than the Chinese room setup. Chinese room setup could only have derivative intentionality. Any intentionality it might have, one, there's the question whether it's real intentionality or not. We could say, oh, it just looks as if it's intentional, much like, you know, the behavior of the sun looks like it's intentional, or the behavior of animals, or the behavior of computers. We can put all kinds of things in here. But if we take the intentional stance to something like a plant and say, well, it's acting, it is turning to face the sun. We're being anthropomorphic, that's as if intentionality. At least that's what Searle would say. It's even what Dennett would say. Not real intentionality, it's just we can be benefited by predicting the behavior of things as if they were intentional. As if they had beliefs about things. Other things have real intentionality, they have real beliefs about things. Thermostats falls into that, possibly. Dogs fall into that. Humans fall into that. Pretty much everyone believes that. But beyond the issue of as if versus real intentionality for the Chinese room, let's say it has real intentionality. Let's say Searle has even admitted that there's some real intentionality there. Searle says, but this would be derivative intentionality. And so there's the Chinese room in the head of a giant robot, or there's me taking my brain out and replacing it with a cyber brain. And if I replace my brain with a cyber brain, well, one of two things happens. Either there's no intentionality, my mental life goes away. I act exactly as I would if I had my normal brain. Even I could switch brain, cyber brain, brain, cyber brain, brain, cyber brain, and you wouldn't be able to tell the difference in my behavior. However, there would be a difference. This is one of two possibilities. The difference is when I have the cyber brain and I'm a zombie, I have no mental life. There's nothing qualitative it's like to be me. In that case, you would still talk about me and predict and explain my behavior based on intentional language. But it would only be as if I have intentions, because I do not have any mental content that's directed at things, and therefore there is no intentionality there. It's just smart programming that makes it look as if I have a mind that's directed at things. So possibility one, cyber brain makes me a zombie. In that case, it looks like I have intentionality, but really that's only apparent intentionality. Second case, you give me a cyber brain, and I do actually still maintain my mental experiences. I do still have a mind. Maybe it's just like my brain, the mind I have when I have my normal brain in. Maybe there's some connection between the cyber brain and the brain so they can communicate with each other. So you switch between brain and cyber brain, and I actually maintain all the beliefs, all the memories I had. In that case, I do have a mental life. I have a mental life just like I do now, complete with a mind, all of my mental content, all of my intentional mental content, propositional attitudes, thoughts that represent intentionally the world. Now, is this a counterexample to Searle? Well, it's not a counterexample at all, because, this is a thought experiment. But would this challenge Searle? Searle would say, at least at times, he says, no, it wouldn't. And the reason is that in order to have original intentionality, you have to have a brain. Cyber brain, you have intentionality. We can even say it's real intentionality, but it's not original intentionality, because that intentionality depends on, well, in this case, two things. The programmers and the engineers who produced the cyber brain, they had intentionality. They knew how to design the brain so that it could have a symbol system that led to a semantic system. The translation of the syntax to the semantics, that rule book was given by the designers, and this cyber brain, second, the cyber brain was somehow influenced by my brain. My brain had original intentionality. The engineers, the programmers had original intentionality. The cyber brain has real intentionality, but it's only derivative of the original intentionality of the programmers, the engineers, and my brain. If we ever got intentionality, and he's agnostic here. He does seem to want to say that a cyber brain would lead you to be a zombie. No intentionality. But that's not his main point. His main prey is the issue of original intentionality, and he's willing to say, well, maybe if you got a cyber brain, you would still have real intentionality, but that would be derivative intentionality, not original intentionality. And there's a reason for making this move, it seems. I mean, we do have to account for the origin of meaning. In general, capital M, meaning. How do we get meaning in the world? If we're not going to do something spooky and appeal to something science can't explain, then how do we get there? We can't get there developmentally, because we say, well, look, we developed meaning. We were born without the ability to have intentional representations of the world, but at some point we developed it through learning. And therefore the meaning I have in my head is a response to training up with the environment. Okay, but how did we get that ability to acquire that meaning? And so we get this sort of push back, push back, push back. Where does meaning come from in the world? What is the ontological origin of meaning? And Searle says, well, the ontological origin of meaning, the cyberbrain, where did the cyberbrain get intentionality? Where did the computer get intentionality? If the computer has intentionality, well, it got it from a human brain. Human brains are magical, they're biological, and that gives them original intentionality. Stop the conversation. Where does intentionality come from? Where does meaning come from? Where does semantics come from? Original intentionality. Where does original intentionality comes from? It's just a property of brains. That's not an explanation. If we take it to be an explanation, something spooky is going on there. Intentionality, where did it come from? Magic. Magic of the brain. So the fact that if we replaced my brain with a cyber brain and I would end up either a zombie or not a zombie but with only derivative intentionality says that there's something special about biological systems, namely they and only they can give us original intentionality. But then Dennis says, but look, then this special thing of Searle's, this biological original intentionality, is something that does not matter at all. If I could act just as I act, same input-output relationships, and not have a mental experience, then mental experience doesn't seem to matter much, at least as far as input and output. Now, it does matter interpersonally. I like my mind. I would like to keep my mind. But if Searle's willing to allow that a cyber brain could give me a mind, but only with derivative intentionality, then original intentionality doesn't matter at all. It doesn't make a difference. Not to inputs to outputs, not to my mental experience. So why make the move to original intentionality at all? Well, the reason Searle does is because he needs to explain the origin of intentionality, and he does it by saying original intentionality. But this is like the Cartesian move. Right? Descartes said, well, how do mind and body interact? Well, they interact at the pineal gland. Well, that's not an answer. Where does intentionality come from? Well, it comes from original intentionality. That's not an answer. So Dennis says, well, there is no such thing as original intentionality. It makes no sense. Our intentionality, maybe it's sexier than the intentionality of a thermostat or a computer or a cyber brain me. But this is a difference of degrees, not of type. Now, interestingly, the selection we read from Dennett was against the possibility of strong AI, at least the strongest of the strong AIs, but for very different reasons than Searle. He certainly did not think it was because we have original intentionality and that allowed us to go from syntax to semantics, and anything we produce could not go from syntax to semantics alone, but only with our help. And our help would impart our original intentionality on that thing, magic touch, come to life machine. Dr. Frankenstein and God here. Dennett doesn't buy these sorts of claims. He says, look, human intentionality is itself derivative. It's derivative of our evolutionary history. The intentionality we have derived from natural selection, the intentionality of natural selection. It's a bit strange, and it gets a bit difficult to understand what Dennett is doing here, but he says that Mother Nature, that is an analog for the activities of natural selection, has intentionality. And it's not clear here if he's taking the intentional stance, or if he really wants to say that Mother Nature has real intentionality. But part of the reason this is confusing is because it doesn't really work to talk about Dennett this way, because there is no such thing as real versus non-real intentionality. There's intentionality all over the place. It's just a matter of degrees. Mother Nature has some intentionality. It has representations that are about things, or it has purpose. It does things for a reason. That's the claim. Why are certain metabolic processes common and others not common? Well, they're common because they serve a purpose of propagating a certain species, keeping a species alive. Mother Nature chose, that is, got rid of all the other metabolic processes because they did not serve the purpose of keeping the species alive. Now, natural selection is a mindless, algorithmic, formal system, it seems. Put that aside for a second. Come back to that. The new concept here is teleology. Study of purpose, telos, purpose. The study of purpose. And what we're doing here is saying that Mother Nature is teleological, it is purpose-directed. And Dennett doesn't really explain the teleological account of mental content, of meaning, of semantics. He sort of mentions that that is what's going on. The teleological account gives us an account of the origin of meaning, and it also does not turn on original intentionality. Okay, done with Dennett. Move on to Papineau. Any disagreement between Papineau and Dennett is an internal disagreement among teleologists. That is, those who think you give a teleological account of the origin of meaning. Papineau says, look, there's an issue with functionalism. Functionalism looked at, well, it was open to this objection of Cummings, and Papineau's talking about this objection that Cummings has to formalism, functionalism. He says, functionalism just gave us a concept analysis. All it was explaining, sorry, not explaining, but analyzing the concept of a functional role. And for concept analysis, early on, premise 2 here, no, premise 3 here, to say that computers have only syntax is something contentful. To say that purely formal systems have only syntax is not contentful, but it is concept analysis. It is giving us an account of the concept. If I just restate something, I'm still giving a concept analysis. Functionalism gave us a concept analysis. It gave us other ways of thinking about, talking about the same thing. And Cummings pointed out that, well, functionalism doesn't explain anything. Rather, it says that to have a functional role is to, or to have a mental state is to have a certain functional role. To have that functional role is to have certain input-outputs. Have certain input-outputs is to have that mental content. So we have a tight circle of 2 or 3 things, but this is a definitional circle, not a causal circle. And Papineau points this out, says, well, look, functionalism only gives us concept analysis, not explanation. It looked at efficient causation. So if we go back to Aristotle, Aristotle talks about 4 different kinds of causation. Now in science we generally talk only about efficient causation, and that is sort of billiard ball causation. Thing A hits thing B moves away. A hit B, A caused B to do something. Temporally it's directed that way. A first, A interacting with B second, B reacting. Action, interaction, reaction, efficient causation. Formalism talked that way. It said input, mental content, that is formal relationship, output. That's efficient causation. However, there's also teleological causation, and this we generally don't talk about, at least not in physics. It is talked about in biology under adaptationism, but is somewhat controversial as to whether or not science, biology should allow adaptationalist explanations. Teleology is not efficient-based. It does not have the same temporal direction. It has the opposite temporal direction. It's in-looking. It explains things for the purpose, for their purpose, the reason they exist. Efficient causation tells us how. Teleological causation tells us why. Right? So earlier when we said, well, why do we see certain metabolic processes in a certain species? Well, it's because, and that because is a why, not a how, because the other ones didn't survive. That is, this metabolic process played a role in the purpose of the survival of that species. Natural selection, Mother Nature recognized this, got rid of all the others. That's anthropomorphic there. Nonetheless, it seems to be intentional, or at least it's claimed to be intentional because it's purposeful based. Okay. So difference between efficient causation, teleological causation. Functionalism, entirely efficient causation based. You have an input, mental content defines what the output will be. Action of the input, reaction of the input and the output at the mental state, at the functional content, functional role, reaction of the output. Teleology explains why mental content exists, and this is a real explanation. It deepens and makes more refined our concept of mental content, our understanding of mental content. Functionalism didn't do this, it just gave us different words that mean the same thing. Maybe that expands us a little bit by giving us other ways to talk about the same thing, but it doesn't give us connection to larger things. Connecting mental states to purposes and explaining them in terms of purposes, that expands, deepens our understanding. And so it's interesting because here we get an account of beliefs, that is one kind of intentional content, in terms of desires, a different kind of intentional concept. So if I believe there's peanut butter in the refrigerator, my belief, my thought is about the peanut butter in the refrigerator. If I want there to be peanut butter in the refrigerator, my want is about the peanut butter in the refrigerator. But those are different mental states. They're different intentional stances. To stand in relation to peanut butter in the refrigerator as a belief and to stand to peanut butter in the refrigerator as a desire, those are different stance. Content the same, my mental relationship to that content different. And the teleological account of mental content says that, well, beliefs are explained by the role they play in satisfying desires. If I have beliefs about the world, and those beliefs are true, they will help me realize my desire. If I believe there's peanut butter in the refrigerator, and there is peanut butter in the refrigerator, the belief, being intentional about the peanut butter in the refrigerator, why did I have that belief? I had that belief because having that belief would help me with a different mental state, my desire that I eat peanut butter. The belief exists because of the role it plays in sating my desire for peanut butter. The desire exists because of the purpose it plays in keeping me alive, keeping me happy, perpetuating my gene line. So I explain why desires exist, because they play a role in the purpose I derive from natural selection, perpetuating my gene line. Desires because purpose of perpetuating the gene line. Beliefs because of the purpose of fulfilling my desires. So I've explained the origin of beliefs in terms of desires, the origin of desires in terms of evolutionary purposes. Now, peanut butter is this very specific belief, and that does not come from evolution. There was no peanut butter in my evolutionary past. Rather, it comes through learning, association. It's all still very complicated. But I have, nonetheless, the same sort of teleological explanation that in the past I've been conditioned, I was hungry, I was given peanut butter, I found peanut butter enjoyable, and I stopped being hungry, and then I was conditioned to desire peanut butter. We have this ability to learn new desires, new ways to fulfill our needs. Papineau says, well, look, there was another thing with functionalism is this disjunctivitis. It had this problem with the disjuncts. Originally, it looked like only identity theory had this problem, but then we see with Cummings that functionalism has this problem too. And then he says, well, the teleological account gets around this because with functionalism, the input is not, say, peanut butter leads me to have my mouth water, but rather peanut butter or things that look and smell like peanut butter, be they, you know, lard that's dyed a certain way and has peanut smell put on it, then that leads to my mouth watering. So we have a disjunct there as an input. And Papineau says, well, teleological account gets around it because you explain all of these in terms of the purpose, and there's a single purpose, perpetuation of the gene line, things like this. And so the disjunct is on the opposite end. Rather than as the input of the nomological generalization, it's the output of the nomological generalization or something like this. This part I don't understand. I don't understand how it could possibly get around the disjunct issue. And two, it's still the case that people are thinking that the disjunct issue is a problem at all. If it's a problem for all of science. And so I just don't understand the disjunct issue. Nonetheless, we can explain beliefs in terms of desires. We can explain desires in terms of the purposes they play, either evolutionarily or in our learning history. And so, back to the Chinese room. This is the teleological account of mental content. Mental content, we have a mind. Minds have mental content that are directed at things. Why are they directed at things? Because by being directed at things, those beliefs play a role. Belief about the world, if it really is accurate representation of the world, then it helps me shape my desires. My desires about the world so as to direct me towards those things. And so this is to explain the origin of intentionality. Where did semantics come from? How did we get from syntax to semantics? Well, it happened by evolution, somehow. Now the question, does this really solve things? Have we done something less spooky here than we did in Searle? And so let's imagine there does exist a purpose in the Chinese room. The Chinese room exists for a purpose, for translating squiggles to squaggles. The rule book exists for a purpose. The individual in the Chinese room has thoughts about the squiggles. Those are intentional, and therefore there's some purpose, some intentionality. I'm using interchangeably, and Papineau uses interchangeably purpose and intentionality because purposes are about things. There is a purpose. There's a thing in the world that is the reason for. And that's an intentional concept. Purpose is an intentional concept. So there's some sort of intentionality in the Chinese room. Whether we say it's real intentionality, as if intentionality, derived intentionality, original intentionality, we're not going to talk that way right now. Right now there's some intentionality in the Chinese room. Then Searle comes along and says, okay, I'll even say that this is real intentionality, but it's derivative intentionality. It's derivative of the programmers. Then Dennett comes along and says, well, but all intentionality, if we don't want to do something magic and spooky, Searle, is derivative intentionality. It's derivative from natural selection. Natural selection choosing, that's anthropomorphic. Natural selection formally, algorithmically getting rid of, through differential reproduction and differential survival rates, getting rid of those who have states that do not promote the purpose of perpetuating the gene line. Through that process of weeding out those that do not perpetuate their gene line, we got natural selection choosing things. And we can say, but that's only as if intentionality. But again, for Dennett, this falls out. There's no difference between as if and intentionality. It's all just degrees of intentionality. But then the question is, but this process of natural selection choosing intentionality, producing through a long series of actions, intentional systems, systems that have semantics. Okay, you said natural selection produces semantics. Natural selection is the explanation of how we got a system that can go from syntax to semantics and have intentionality and have mental content. Okay. But then one of two things has to be true. Either natural selection itself has a semantics, or it doesn't. If it has has semantics, it has meaning, and this is generally denied by everybody, even it seems Dennett. But if it didn't have semantics, if there wasn't meaning in natural selection, it's purely syntactic. But if it's purely syntactic, then it's not that we got semantics from syntax, that is, all we had was syntax and somehow semantics produced, but rather there was a syntactic system with operations, natural selection. That's a syntactic process. If we don't want to say Mother Nature has a real mind that's about things, semantics, all there are is syntax. It's a syntactic algorithmic process, formal process. Natural selection is an algorithmic formal process. That's a syntactical system. But somehow, eventually, over millions and millions of years, it was able to produce semantic systems. Systems that had representational capacities. Now, this is not just humans. We can go way back further than this. Way before we got to humans, we had systems that were able to represent. Remember the sort of phytobacteria? No, is this what it is? The magnioscopes, the plankton that have magnetic receptors that represent a direction, right? This was in, I guess, Dretske. Very early on in evolution, we get things that can represent the world. Representations are symbols that are about things. They're intentional. But we got to that point through a system that was purely syntactical. Either we say Mother Nature has a mind and is semantic, or we say no, Mother Nature does not, is purely syntactical, but was able to produce semantic systems from a syntactical system. We got a semantic system. But if that's true, then why can't we get minds from computers? Computers as defined as purely formal systems. Systems that only have syntax. Why can't we get, with enough time of development, semantic systems from purely syntactic systems? Why is it not just a matter of degree? At some point, we hit a syntactic system that's complicated enough that it develops a semantics, a meaning. If Mother Nature could do it, why can't computers do it? Why can't computers and computer programmers do it? If that's true, then Searle's second premise that we can't get semantics from syntax alone, that is, you can't get a semantical system from a syntactical system alone, is false. So it seems that with the Chinese room and with the teleological account of the origin of semantics, we have to choose between something spooky, Mother Nature has a mind, there is original intentionality, or saying that we can get minds, well, we can get semantic systems from syntactic systems. Choose between two things, something spooky, or we can get semantic systems from syntactical systems alone. If we don't want something spooky, say we're committed to giving a scientific account, then we say we can't get semantic systems from syntactic systems. Then there's an additional question. If we have a semantic system and it has the same input-output relationships as we do, two possibilities. Either that system is a zombie, it acts just like we do, but it does not have a mental life, or it does have a mental life. Think about it. If we get a computer complicated enough so that it can act just like a human in all situations, now this would not just be a computer, it'd have to move around the world, it'd have to be a robot. Looks just like a human, acts just like a human. It's not a human because it does not have DNA, but does it have a mind? If not, it's a zombie. It acts just like us, but it does not have the same qualitative experiences that we do. Maybe that seems comfortable. But if so, it seems like we're getting pushed back into this spooky thing and say, well, but then why do we have minds if it doesn't? Minds are not just an issue of complexity, but rather complexity plus something else. What's the something else? Well, the biological, magical, original intentionality. Okay, But then the other option is to say that, well, this robot that acts just like me, has the same input-output relationships as me, has a mental life. There's something qualitatively about being that computer. It experiences the world. And at this point, it's sort of up to intuition. What is most comfortable to you? Do you like spooky or do you like science? If you like science, do you like zombies or do you like computers with minds? If we say that the computer could be a zombie, then anyone around you could be a zombie. That is, you know that you have a mental life with qualitative experiences. But there's no way you can know that anyone else does. So there could be zombies all around us. There is no way to know the difference. It's a difference that makes no difference. That seems to be intolerable on scientific grounds. And so, if we're opting for science over spooky, then we're pushed in the direction of saying that computers have minds with the full range of intentional, qualitative, mental experiences. And here you see the connection between the Chinese room, internalism, externalism, syntax, semantics, and strong AI. Good luck on your papers.